Alright, so it's time to remove the tape and see what state the fretboard's in underneath here. And that's always a bit of a challenge because the tape basically gets sealed in around the edges with all of the lacquer. So hopefully it'll come up relatively well. Alright, so this is pretty typical of what you find when you remove the tape. You've got a sharp edge along here which is just built up lacquer. You've got some compound that's got in when I was buffing the neck. So it's a matter first of wiping the compound out, and then we're just going to sand those edges flat. So toothpicks are always good for just getting in right in the corner of the fret. Just scraping that compound away, which is dry now anyway. So I've just got like a paddle pop stick, and I'm just going to put some very fine sandpaper on the end of it. Okay, and that's a flexible sanding stick that's really good for just sanding along the edges. Just taking the edge off of the side here, and that's done. That's nice and rounded. I've just got some naphtha here. I'll just use that to clean any residue that's left on the fretboard. Alright, that's one fret done, 20 to go. Now this grit that I'm using is 800, so it's super fine. It's not removing any wood, it's just removing some lacquer and just re-rounding those edges. So this is a pretty boring old process. It'll probably take me half an hour, 45 minutes to get through the whole neck. Pretty monotonous, but it's got to be done. So it's time to level the frets now, and the first thing we want to do is we need to adjust the truss rod, or possibly we don't even need to touch it, but we need to get the neck as straight as possible. So there's a couple of things we can use. One's a straight edge. We just run it up against the frets like that, and I'll tell you what, that's there's no adjustment necessary. That is pretty straight. You also can use a notch straight edge. The notches, it allows you to see how straight the neck is without the frets getting in the way, and that's very straight. Okay, so that's good. There's no adjustment necessary. If there was, you would just use an Allen key. You'd pop it into the truss rod here, and you would adjust it one way or the other as you took the measurement, just an eighth of a turn at a time, quarter of a turn. You wouldn't do any big movements. You wouldn't do a half turn. That's a pretty radical amount of adjustment on a neck at one time. Just small adjustments, and then take a measurement. So you just want to get the neck as straight as possible, because we're going to start taking some of the tops of the frets off to level them all completely flat. So that's flat as is. I don't need to do anything. I'm just going to tape the fretboard up to protect it, and then we're going to level the frets. It's just some painter's tape that I use. You can use anything really. It's just to protect the fretboard, and you just butt it up against the fret and just roll it around the edges. Now, as you get further up the neck, there comes a point where the tape is too wide to fit between the frets. So it's just a matter of cutting it down the middle and using either straight edge, butt them up against the frets and do the join in the middle there. And we're just going to work our way down. So we're just drawing some tape down the sides as well. So basically just covering all of the side of the fretboard, and we're just leaving the edges of the frets exposed. Alright, so you'll end up with something that looks like that. We've taped along the fret edges as well. Alright, so we've got the neck secured, and we just want to double check again that we don't need to adjust the neck. Now I'm looking for any gaps under the frets here. It'll mean I've either got a low fret if there's a gap, and it means I've got a high fret somewhere which has lifted the straight edge up. And I don't need to adjust that. It's pretty straight. I don't imagine we're going to have to remove too much material off these frets to get it level. So this is a sanding beam. You've got a machined edge along here, and you've got a machined edge along here. So these are extremely flat. What I normally do is I put a strip of sticky back sandpaper down one edge and a different grit on the other side. So depending on how much I think I'm going to need to remove from the frets, that'll determine what grit sandpapers I put on here. Now I'm going to put 220 on this side, I'm going to put 320 on this side. If it looked like I had to take more off, I'll probably start with 120 and put 220 on this side. So I'll get some sandpaper on here now, and then we'll level the frets. There's another tool you can use for gauging straightness, and it's this tool from Stu Mac. Now it's got two ground edges which are parallel to each other, and then you've got a just a little dial indicator. The scale on this is 1/1000th of an inch, so it's pretty precise. And what you do is you would calibrate it on a nylon straight edge like so. So it's reading 0, which it is, and then you can place it on various areas on the neck and get a reading. Now obviously it's only going to give you a reading from the frets that it's registered on, but even so it gives you an indication of whether you've got a dip in the neck or whether you've got a bow in the neck, and that reading is really good. That's dead on 0 there, so I'm pretty confident I've got the neck straight, well, without even having to adjust it. The neck is straight, so that's good news. Now the next thing we want to do is we need to put a marker pen over the top of all the frets. We just run a black marker across every fret here, and then when we start sanding, you've got a visual on where you've touched and where you haven't. So if I'm sanding up here and I see the marker is removed from every fret but this fret here, obviously this fret's going to be low, and it's a matter of sanding all the frets until you've touched the top of everything. And because this is precision ground, you know, once you've sanded everything and you've removed all of the marker, that you've got that area flat, dead flat. So we'll start marking the frets. Okay, so we've now got the fretboard all marked off, and I've got my sanding beam here, and I'm going to start off with my 220 grit, and I'm just going to start making passes up the fretboard. Now you don't want to push down, you don't want to deflect the neck, you just want to let the weight of the radius beam do the sanding. So I'll just give you a look at this and you can see what's going on. And we've pretty much cleaned everything up except for a spot there, and there's a spot there. The rest of the fretboard looks pretty good. There's a couple of little spots, but you can see we're getting there. And once the frets are all an even colour on top with the black removed, I'll go on to 320 and I'll just clean up some of the scratch marks. Okay, so they're all level, and I've just flipped the beam over, and I'm just going to give it a couple of passes with 320, and that'll just reduce the amount of scratches that we need to get rid of. Okay, so that's the frets levelled. Now, you notice you've got marker pen there, but that's actually on the side of the fret. So that's just where I've slipped when I've been putting the line on. The actual centre of the fret there is clean. Alright, so we levelled the frets. I'm going to sand some fall away on the bottom 6 or 7 frets. That's basically sanding a ramp upwards so it falls away towards the end of the neck. So when we sand this ramp in, it helps eliminate a lot of fret buzz. You can take your action down a little bit lower and you don't get any buzzes up in this region here. So it's basically like a little ski ramp that we sand in. It's subtle, you're only removing a few thousandths, but it's effective. So we want to count back about 6 frets and put some tape over that fret. Now, depending on what angle we want, we just put a couple of layers of tape on there. Now I'm going to go 2 layers only. Some people go 3. It depends on the thickness of your tape as well, of course. And what I've got here is, it's just a scaled down version of the larger sanding block. It's got different grits on there, and I've just removed a bit of that paper off the end here, and that's going to ride on the fret here, so I'm not hitting that with sandpaper. So obviously the first pass is just, you're going to clip those frets first. And you see we're nearly getting there. We've touched those 3 frets, we've touched that one, and we're just missing that one. So that's what we've achieved. We've got some tape along here which has elevated the height of that fret, and then we've used a small radiusing beam, a sanding beam, to just sand some fall away on those frets. Obviously as you're sanding you can see it'll hit these in sequence, obviously because you're angled like that. This is the last fret. Once that's touched, you stop. So we get our marker pen out again and we mark the top of the fret. I've got a tool like this which is a crowning file. So what we do is we just run this crowning file across the top. So you can see that we've got a shiny spot either side of the fret. That's where we've crowned it. We've actually removed some material from either side. And we've got just a thin little black strip up the middle of the fret, which is what we're after. So I can hit that with some sandpaper from the sides and just knock those edges over, and it reintroduces the crown back on there. Okay, so those frets are all recrowned. Now we just need to, around these edges here, we've beveled them. The bevels still have a sharp edge there, so I'll do that with some 800 grit sandpaper. So I've just got a piece of sanding foam, and that's just as a backer for a bit of 800 grit sandpaper. And I'm just going to run it down the sides of the fretboard here, and just put my finger on the edge here. And what it will do is it will curve in and out because of the sponge, and it will soften the edges of the frets for me. So what we've done is we've just rounded the top of this, and it's actually rounded around the sides here as well. So there's no sharp edges there, and that's the same up and down the fretboard. Right, so the last thing I want to do is just use this foam pad with that's a worn piece of 800 that I've got on there, and I just want to just roll it down over the tops of the frets, and that will soften some of those corners, and it'll take the remaining pen off that's still on there. So now we can actually polish the frets, and I do that with my Dremel. So I've got those little foam pads that go on the Dremel, and I've got some, this is the compound that I use for my my buffing oil, and it's a coarse compound. And what I do is I load it up with some compound, and then I can actually just polish the fret out with this. Now I take it over to the corners as well, and it helps round those over and polish them up. And then I kick the speed up a bit, and I just get the shine on there. So that's done. So I'll get probably half a fretboard done with the one oil, and it's just a matter of changing it out. Put a clone one on. You can see the beautiful shine that you get when you buff it with the Dremel and some compound. They come off absolutely beautiful. Okay, well we're on the home stretch now. We can take all of this tape off. We can put the tuners in. First thing I want to do is just press those bushings in. if you're worried about any of the screw holes being filled with lacquer, you can just rebore them with it's just an attachment for the screwdriver, and it has the correct thread on it. So the last thing we need to do is to just condition the fretboard, just oil it. I've got some lemon oil here, just drop that on, let it soak in, then wipe it off, and I'll do that twice. Don't be afraid to put it on relatively thick. The fretboard will soak it in, and what it doesn't soak in we're just going to wipe off anyway, so you don't want it dripping down the sides, but you go be generous. Alright, so I'm just wiping off the excess now. Alright, well that's the neck complete. There's a fair amount of work in building a neck. It's all polished up, the frets are polished, we've oiled the fretboard, we've got the tuners in, we've buffed the neck. We can move on to building the body, which will be another set of videos. There's no nut in there yet. I'll put the nut in when I set the guitar up. Now, I wouldn't normally have finished a neck like this and sprayed it before doing the body. I'd build them together, just solely because if I'm going to be spraying lacquer, it makes sense to spray the body and the neck at the same time. I'll just put this somewhere safe, and when the body's built we can attach it and finish the guitar off.